Great. Well, welcome everybody and welcome to the American Library in Paris's Evenings with an Author program. Tonight we have a special panel speaking about technology and ethics with Christine Finn as moderator, Mike Cassidy, and Nicholas Hall as our panelists. I'm Catherine Olien, Programs Manager at the American Library. For those of you who are just discovering us through this program, we are the largest English language lending library on the continent. And we're also more than just a space full of books. We are a vibrant cultural center and an event space. So traditionally, we host adult programs in the evenings at least twice a week. And we've moved to Zoom for the time being, of course, to make sure that everyone is staying safe. So welcome to anybody who's just joining us for the first time. We're also an independent nonprofit, so we thrive on the support of our community, our members, and the generosity of our donors. And thanks to those of you in the audience who belong to any of those categories, as well to anybody new, of course, again. 2020 wasn't actually all bad for us. We were able to celebrate our centennial, so we've officially turned 100, and we had an online virtual gala, which was a tremendous success. And we've really been just very, very pleased with the way the community has come together and sort of helped us transition to mostly being an online institution using our online resources. But we are back open for browsing right now with limited study space available if you're local, so you can head into the library if you need to use us. And we're looking forward to a bright year ahead, of course, in 2021. You can learn more about us on our homepage, and we're sort of all over on social media. So not only do we have the YouTube channel with our events posted, but we also have a Facebook page, a Twitter, an Instagram, of course, and I invite you to check out our homepage for other events as well. So tonight since we have so many wonderful speakers, I'll be letting them introduce themselves. And we'll start with Christine Finn and move just after to Nicholas Hall and finally to Mike Cassidy. So Christine, go ahead and take it away, please.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Thanks so much for being here. I'm a creative archaeologist and journalist and broadcaster, and I came to retro technology through being in Silicon Valley by happenstance, and fell into this great area of old tech. And for 20 years, we've been charting the change over time in technology and retro tech and what it means today. So yeah, that's my basic spiel.
Hi, hi everybody. Nicholas Hall. I first met Christine back when I lived out in the Silicon Valley area almost 20 years ago, and I had this idea for networking online, like business networking online, which hard to believe it was a novel idea 20 some years ago, but that also reminded me how old I was. So thanks for that, Christine. And but it's been a real I've developed this kind of love-hate relationship with social media and technology, and it's been a great enabler and a great frustrator all at the same time. So I've had a lot of experiences with my nonprofit, with technology, with my ventures, and currently I'm also an strategic alliance director with Ernst & Young. So deal with a lot of technology during my day job as well. And I'm joining you all virtually today from Bloomington, Indiana. Thanks for having me.
Great. I'm Mike Cassidy. I spent about 30 years at the Mercury News, which is known as the newspaper of Silicon Valley. It used to be called the San Jose Mercury News, but through a series of acquisitions and delusions, it's just become the Mercury News. But why I guess Christine invited me to this, and thank you very much. For the last few years at the Mercury News, I covered Silicon Valley kind of through the eyes of the culture of the Valley, I would say, how it was at that time distinct, and what drove the Valley. And so I covered a lot of startups, and as the world for newspapers shrunk, what we called newspapers, news organizations, after covering startups, I actually joined one and went to work telling stories. I was actually called a storyteller. My wife and kids thought I went in and sat in a rocking chair and read books to everybody during their downtime. That wasn't quite it. And I moved on from that startup to a second startup where I am now. It's called Signified, And what actually both those startups did was support e-commerce through the use of a lot of data. So we're kind of right in the soup of it, but in a very different way, I would say, from social media. But we can talk about all that. And I'm coming to you from Palo Alto, which is in California, which is in Silicon Valley. Well, Palo Alto is in Silicon Valley, which is in California.
When I first arrived there, Mike, I was like, where's Silicon Valley? I don't see it on the map anywhere. I can't find it.
Exactly right.
It's a state of mind, man.
So when tourists would come, or family, they would want to see Silicon Valley, and I could never figure out where to take them until one smart editor at the Mercury News said, "You take them to Fry's," which was this huge emporium of electronic stuff, which is also suffering and kind of going extinct.
So it brings what you just said brings me back to my real reason for getting involved with RetroTech was when I was an archaeologist and looking at change over time and looking at the acceleration of change over time in Silicon Valley, which is how I got into writing a book about artifacts, about tech artifacts. And I thought it was quite useful now to think about how we got to the point that we're at with technology by going back into the sort of the prehistory, as it were, all the way back to the late 90s. And getting a sense of how we all started with technology. I think I'm going to ask a very journalistic question of us, all three of us, about how old we are. I think that's really important to distinguish that, and Catherine actually as well, because it's about generations of technology and the way that we receive them intergenerationally as well as generationally. Now I'm 61. Mike, how old are you?
I just turned 62.
Okay.
So 62 in 3 weeks or so.
Okay. Happy birthday.
Thank you. That's why
50, yeah, 51.
51. Okay. Yeah, so I want to ask a question of both of you. I'll start with Mike. So how old were you when you first got a computer? And can you say something about your first introduction to technology?
Well, yeah, I knew we were going to be talking about this. So thinking back and looking into it, the first thing that struck me was I didn't know exactly. I've done some research to figure out when that all was. So I guess at the time it wasn't some huge, I remember when I got my first car. I remember when I got my first bike. But anyway, to answer the question, I was about 35, I think. And it was I bought it secondhand from the Mercury News. They were so generous that they were throwing out computers, but decided instead to sell them to their employees. And it was a Radio Shack HD 1000, something, Tandy 1000. I bought it for $300 and I was off and running from there.
Nicholas, thank you.
Yeah, like mid 20s. I started at Price Waterhouse when I was 22, and we carried around this lug of a thing. I think it only do maybe Lotus 1, 2, 3. I don't think it did much more than that. But then when I left after I got my CPA license and was at a financial services firm and got into the Dell refurbished desktop. I was like a big Dell refurbished desktop customer for probably a good decade or so. But yeah, mid 20s, got my first Dell desktop.
And what is it, or what did it mean to I'll start again with Mike, to you to have a computer? I mean, how did it change your world?
Well, to be honest, the reason I decided to take the plunge was I felt like I was just lacking knowledge and understanding. I don't know that it mattered that I was in Silicon Valley. I was in the world, right? And at that time, it was starting to get to be a pretty big thing, all this personal technology stuff. And I wasn't at the time even covering the Valley. I think I was covering a city council or something, but I just started to feel like, I don't know what's happening. I don't get it. I didn't really understand the internet. I mean, I'm not saying I'm much of an expert now, but I didn't quite get, like, what were people doing? What did it look like? And I just thought I should know those things. So I remember Pete Carey, a colleague of mine, great journalist, won a couple Pulitzer Prizes. He showed me Gopher, and I was like, oh. I thought, huh. So it was just this thing that was somewhat incomprehensible to me, and didn't seem like this rich world of content, which of course it wasn't. I mean, you find the content, but it was mostly that. It was mostly a sense that I needed to find out what this was all about. How it changed my life, it meant that my mom would frequently get upset with me because she couldn't call me anymore without getting a busy signal, because I had something like, I had a 1200 or 2400 baud modem that would connect me to the world on this Radio Shack computer. And so to me, I think it built pretty slowly. It didn't like transform my life immediately.
Okay, thank you. Nicholas?
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to get online. So, I mean, part of that was the access to getting online, was having a computer, and then being in financial services, there was some basic kind of communication back and forth between myself and the broker dealer and the financial services. I can't recall exactly what all we shared back and forth. I'm sure it was pretty, basic kind of quarterly statements or monthly statements, but for me, part of it was, some basics with business, and then just also curious. I mean, AOL did a heck of a job of like throwing CDs. CDs were all over. They were just sending them everywhere to the current resident. It felt like of every address in the U.S. So we were getting. I think, didn't we have to pay for hours back then? Is that what it was? You right? You were your first 100 hours free or whatever, and it seemed awfully interesting to me. So,
and what about the transition to email? So you've talked about AOL, and Mike, do you remember your first email?
Yeah, I don't literally remember, the Watson come quickly moment, but I'm sure it was on AOL. I had mail, and I had an AOL account, email account that I used for both work and personal stuff, which, I mean, maybe is not that unique. I don't know. I found it kind of a strange thing to do with all that stuff mixed up. When you think about the number of emails you get now, it would be kind of hard to manage. But I don't really remember all that, what I used it for all that much, because I didn't know a lot of other people who had email. But all that, the thing about it was, all that changes pretty quickly. Like, there's an acceleration of everything. And so it became a common way to communicate with my parents. They lived in Chicago, I lived out here. And then it became a much, an increasingly useful tool for work.
Nicholas?
Yeah, I think we talk about with today with social media and messages and the endorphin rush. I mean, it was the endorphin of you've got mail. It's which is no different than the excitement that I think we still get if you get a letter, you get an actual letter in the mail from someone. It's exciting. Someone's reached out to communicate with you, and certainly it was just so much more novel, obviously, back then. So it was always interesting to see what on earth how someone could have found me and how they're communicating. Obviously, the AOL really kind of owned a lot of the content that was coming at you. So, but it still was exciting to get mail.
I think, getting back to Mike, what you were saying about the acceleration of change over time, can I just ask you for your sort of personal history of that change over time at the Mercury News? I'm someone who started in journalism on, old typewriters and hot metal when I was 16, and seen all those changes over time. Can you describe what happened to you? And also, because it was the Mercury News, it was so successful as a newspaper, and it was so successful with the classified ads. And then, of course, people started to take those away onto the digital platform, which didn't help the paper in terms of its income.
No, it didn't help at all. And in fact, I mean, I don't know whether it's an overgeneralization, but a lot of people talked about the decline of newspapers, print newspapers. The problem being, well, nobody reads newspapers anymore, ranging everything from that to, well, you're so liberal and have such an agenda, nobody will buy that anymore. Well, that wasn't the problem. I mean, the problem was advertising. It went away. And the Mercury News, I should be a smarter business mind, but I'm not. For some reason, it had a huge, it was sort of overly dependent on classified advertising. And I think maybe that was the Silicon Valley job market, but it made up more than the standard share of advertising dollars. So that was a huge hit when that happened. And so, I don't really blame Craigslist and hot jobs and all those things that were coming up. I mean, I kind of wish newspapers maybe had been a little smarter about, well, let's get in on this, let's partner, let's create our own thing. But newspapers are making huge profits, and I think they got fat and happy. They were there to be disrupted, and they got disrupted. Now I forgot the first part of your question.
Oh yeah, how your own personal life changed with the Mercury.
Well,
yeah.
Yeah, so when I got there, I am old, but I never worked other than in high school. I always worked on some kind of computer when I worked at newspapers. Well, when I started at the Mercury News, it was essentially like a mainframe model. We had little SII computers. They almost look like iMacs. They were like these bullet-shaped things that were connected to one central computer. And we would type away our stories on these kind of green screens, and probably why I can't see anymore, but see as well as I did, rather. But so the Mercury and other newspapers were actually kind of slow in adopting technology because it's expensive. You have to swap everything out. So we didn't have, the Mercury News was online, and one of the leaders in being an online newspaper. And this again goes back to AOL, which is where it started with Mercury Center. But at that time, its own reporters didn't even have a way to access Mercury Center without going like into the corner of the newsroom, and there was like one PC that you were able to look at Mercury Center. And so this evolved probably more slowly than personal technology in my personal life, but eventually we did end up having laptops and online access and all the things that you would think would come fairly naturally in a newspaper. I think the biggest whiz bang thing that happened at all early on was, again, going back to Radio Shack, we called them Trash 80s, and they were portable computers. I mean, maybe people are familiar with them, but they were portable computers that had screens that were about, I don't know, maybe 2 or 3 inches high and 8 inches across, and you would type, and that's all you could see. You'd type your stories, and then you'd have to find a payphone because, if you're out in the field, because it had acoustic couplers that you would jam the phone receiver onto. And so you're holding this computer and you have these acoustic couplers and you're trying to dial a payphone. And you try that for 30 minutes or so as deadline approached. And then you'd say, the heck with it, and call the city desk and dictate your story off this little tiny screen in the dark that you could barely read. So it took a little while, but the one thing I remember is carrying that thing around. I was covering a congressional campaign and I was in some hotel ballroom and, trying to write my story. And I don't know if it was a crowd, but it was probably like 2 or 3 people came around like, what is that? And I suddenly felt like, the wizard. Although I didn't go into the whole story about how it wasn't quite perfect technology yet, but I mean that's my one evolution story, I guess, from the early Mercury days.
Thank you. I mean, it sounds like ancient history, doesn't it? It's incredible.
I mean, it's hard to remember, honestly, and hard to even put myself back in that place. But
and of course, the entrepreneurs you were writing about included people like Nicholas. So Nicholas, can you say a little bit about startupfailures.com and what was behind that, and yeah, how that evolved to?
Yeah, that was a joke. I was like, well, if I can fail at startup failures, then what? Then what am I going to do? So, and that was really the whole purpose of that. Was I had been working at, I had founded a company. The company was called, we called it Intori, Intori. Don't search it. I don't think it comes up. I don't think it means anything. It just was 3 syllables. It ended it had all, all the good things for a .com name that you were supposed to do back then. But like I said, it was essentially, the idea was, I go to a networking event. There's 100 people in the room. Who should I meet? I don't know. I have no idea. So I don't know who they are. I don't know what they do. I don't know anything about them. What if we put our profiles online and we can connect maybe ahead of time? So again, kind of a simple idea. And unfortunately, it was not a big enough of an idea. Frankly, it wasn't pets.com. So I couldn't get any funding for it. But, we gave it a go for probably, I guess, 2.5, 3 years of, trying this, trying that. And back then you had to do a lot of coding, and you had to try and, there was no minimum viable product. You had to really do frankly, a lot of work to get even a demo. And so, but anyhow, everything, as you all know, imploded in the early 2000s, and so we just didn't see a way to keep it going. And I wasn't sure what I was going to do next, but that just the idea, frankly, of startup failures was, there are like hundreds of people like me who show up to Northern California or wherever we are with a startup idea, and based on everything that you were reading in Fast Company, Wired, there were just so many startup magazines. You've kind of felt like you had to be a complete idiot not to be somewhat successful. Like you were just was like, so, but there were a lot of us like myself who were pretty smart folks, and it was a lot harder than we thought it was going to be. And so there were a lot of us that were, I think, really frankly struggling with our self-esteem, and kind of how to turn this experience into something positive, into something useful. And that really was the impetus for the idea. It was all about kind of, this idea of, I bet I'm not the only one. And so Startup Failures was really a community. It was never intended to be a for-profit venture. It really always was intended to be community. And that's what it was. And for several years. And it was so interesting for me to get communications from people around the world, sharing that, that, wow, we had no idea, based on what we read from Silicon Valley. We just thought there was, venture capitalists were saying yes to everybody, and all I had to do was show up with a decent idea and a URL, and I'd get money. And I think that, in Europe, and I think Japan in particular, that entrepreneurs, not, I don't know if it's still the case today, but certainly 20 years ago, if you had this badge of having failed, it was something that they felt like would stick with them for a long time. And it was something that would be very difficult to ever come back from, versus, being able to see it as a learning experience. And so that was really, that was enlightening to me. That was something that I wasn't aware of. It did give me the opportunity to then go and do some speaking in some of those countries, which that was fantastic and really enjoyable. And so that's part of the beautiful part of technology, how it created connections that would not have happened otherwise.
Thanks. I mean, that is a segue into the other part of our discussion, really, which is about 2.0. and the difference that the changes that happened when people were able to communicate in a different way through social media, where things like failure, whereas in the past were seen to be, as you say, a sort of almost a badge to be worn, became another way of targeting people. But I want to sort of rein back a little bit and go back to your first experience of social media. I mean, both of you. Mike, would you like to have a go at that, please?
Yeah, again, I hope I found myself, I hope I walked into the right Zoom room, because I certainly wasn't hostile to these sort of things, but I just didn't get it often when it came to like the next thing in technology. And I would think, gosh, I don't know, things are okay now. Why would I want to get into that? And what if I really like it and it, disrupts my little cocoon or something like that? But with social media, I joined Twitter in 2006, I think it was, or probably 8. It was 2 years after Twitter was founded. I joined Twitter, and I joined Facebook, I think, even before that, a year or so before Twitter. And that was prompted primarily by another colleague, Chris O'Brien, who was saying, hey, we're journalists. We ought to be, we ought to be on Facebook. We ought to be on Twitter. And I'm like, face what, huh? And so I kind of put it off, and he kept pressing. And then he said, at one point he said something like, well, you're not a real journalist if you're not on these. I was like, oh boy, okay. I always wanted to be a real journalist, so I guess I will. And so I joined, and initially really didn't do a lot with either platform. But I started to find Facebook really kind of enchanting, and used it not at all as a journalist, or very little. I used it, I have a large family, and started using it that way. And I live apart from many of them, not far, but different states. And it was really kind of cool to keep in touch that way. And I certainly did get that social media rush, when people were paying attention to me, or somebody would have a common memory and photos and things like that. And so I did get more and more into that. Twitter, I didn't really get going on until a little bit later, and used it much more, probably more promotionally than anything, but much more in a work context. Though it did come in handy as a reporter, you could connect with people, right? Or you could find, it's gotten now, I sound like the angry old get off my lawn guy, but it's gotten so that reporters will just quote tweets, or maybe they had no alternative, but you'd think it'd be better like if you went and talked to somebody. But it does provide context, and the catch being, who was that, or what was that tweeted that? But anyway, so it became a lot more ingrained in my day-to-day life and work. And now, I probably am in the need for intervention zone, though I really don't recognize that, because I don't have a problem. I could stop any time, maybe.
Thanks, Mike. Nicholas, would you like to say something
Yeah.
about the foundation, please? Because and the way that has helped your, social media has helped you.
Yeah, so my foundation, Graham's Foundation, was, I created that 11 years ago in memory of my son, Graham, who died as a result of being born prematurely. And for a lot of families that are going through the premature birth of a baby, typically it is often it's a first time experience, right? Sure, there are some that go through it more than once, but for most of the parents, it's the first time, and it's a shock, and it's not anything that you're planning for, and you don't read that part of the book. You don't have anything set up. You're not, again. And so what do families do? They typically go and they search online, and then they search for community as well. And so that is, for us, about 75% of the families that find us and leverage our support find us through a mobile device, and they find us through search. And so, so we have, I think, 60 some odd thousand, whatever you want to, I don't know what you call likes, followers, whatever, on our Facebook page and our, Instagram. And I mean, that's been, for a lot of, we have a lot of different support services that we provide, but for some, for some folks, some parents, just being able to kind of connect virtually and be able to, see and feel other families' experiences and get some support and encouragement, just helps them along their way and along their path. So fortunately, I have a fantastic team that manages all of that, because it is quite a bit to manage from a communication perspective. But it has proved to be definitely a very powerful tool for our nonprofit.
Thank you for sharing that, Nicholas. Something that you and I have talked about is the Wayback Machine and the idea of traces that are being left online by our use of it, of social media and before that. How do you feel about Wayback?
Is that a question to me? Because
yes, it is. Sorry.
Just a little bit. Well, I'm again not an expert in Wayback, but I find it to be a pretty cool thing. Except that generally I can't find the exact page I'm looking for. But
would you like to define what Wayback is for people?
I'll do my best, and maybe someone can help. But it's a way to search back to find an internet page as it was at a certain point in time. That's about the depth of my understanding of it. But of course, I don't know that it's of course, but not every single page, every single moment is there. And so I'm usually looking for things that I've written. No, I'm kidding. But so you can only go way back to so many different things. And I think it'd be pretty cool if you could go way back to anything, anytime. But if you think YouTube puts a strain on storage, I'm not sure what that would look like. So I think it's a way. I'm sort of a lazy historian, and so it's sort of an incredible way to put yourself back in a place. I mean, preparing for this conversation, I realized, frankly, how much I had forgotten, in terms of context and emotion about some of these times, these distant times way back in the 90s and such. But there was, and so I don't know if this was an individual thing or a communal thing. I'm sure it was different for everybody, but there was a sense, a certain feeling, and I think that's probably true of a lot of eras and decades, but even the pre-Web 2.0, just this, probably something that fed into a challenge Nicholas talked about, but there was just this energy and this optimism, some of it apparently misplaced, but in the Valley, there was a sense that everything was going to succeed. And I think I'm certain it was a naive sense, and I'm certain it wasn't held by everyone, but some people were in such a position that they didn't need everything to succeed. If like 1 out of 10 things could succeed, they'd do fine. And, so there was no sense in trying to disabuse anyone of this notion if you were ready to, prosper from it. And not necessarily in an evil way. It sounds like I'm putting it that way, but businesses need investment, ideas need investment. I just think maybe I'm feeling a little guilty myself that I was certainly energized, and for better or worse, my column was kind of fun and kind of featurey, not investigative by any means. And it certainly fed this idea of what a kooky, wacky, incredible place where you can have fun and get rich too. So, I think it's good to have these historic references you can go back to, either to say, whoa, sure got that wrong, or to say, hey, like, remember how sometimes you only remember the good parts? Let's take a look at what this thing really looked like overall.
And those were terrific columns, Mike. I really enjoyed those. And certainly when I landed in Silicon Valley for the first time in late 1999, it was a place that felt very vibrant and optimistic, and anything could happen. Now we move on again to the ethical side of things, and the idea of a digital detox and giving up, putting the off button on. Would either of you like to talk about that, please?
I've discovered the sleep mode of my iPhone's been great, and just like automatically quieting. I turned off all my notifications. I used to have 4,000 plus contact connections on LinkedIn, and the 2,000 plus on Facebook. And I was like, for what? Like, if someone really wants to get a hold of me, I'm easy to find. You can type my name. You can go to, I've got my own personal website. I haven't changed my cell number in 20 some odd years. I'm not hiding. So, if you have a real good reason to connect, like, send me a note and tell me why we should connect, and let's see what, kind of go from there. I found that for me personally, the more noise, the more context, the more of everything, the less value that any of it really has. So I feel like, I have a very limited and targeted use, and for Facebook, for LinkedIn, for Instagram, some of those tools, they're great for what I leverage them for, but I don't have uses kind of frankly beyond some of those very tactical purposes.
Thanks. Mike, is there too much information that we have that we just can't get through and understand?
I don't know. I kind of hear detox and I think, why? But seriously, I am, so like probably everybody almost, I think I'm pretty good about these things. I don't take my phone out at dinner. I don't, it's on now, but I'm not paying attention to it. So I feel like I can act in a way I consider appropriately. If I'm talking to someone, I'm not checking my phone. But I'm paying more attention lately. And I think, this notion of seeing a red dot and just running to it, in terms of a notification, when that little red bell lights up or whatever, I have to turn off, like a lot of people at work, we use Slack. And, when I'm trying to write something, I'll stop and click on this Slack thing because it came by. Why? Maybe that's part of my job, but I know there's other things part of my job. Why don't I get to pick what part of my job is more important and just do it? So I have to turn off notifications sometimes when I write and things like that. Is there too much information? I don't know. I mean, I guess like Nicholas sounds like he has a plan, and I think maybe that's the answer. Is there's a lot of information. You just have to figure out what of it you're going to pay attention to and when, I guess. And I'm not, it's more do as I say, not do as I do. I'm not trying to preach because I have not figured it out. And I think in some ways it's because I'm too lazy. I try to avoid notifications, but sometimes I get notifications. It's like, well, where do I go find that in my phone? How to do that? It's like, forget it. So that's kind of where I am, as fascinating as all that is.
Thank you. What about regulation? How do you feel about regulating the internet?
Well, it scares me partly out of ignorance, probably. I did, I think in some of our early talks about this program, we talked about the social dilemma, and I was rewatching that or watching it, and there was a poor man. I can't remember his name. There was a senator from Utah, I think it was, talking, I think, to Zuckerberg and that whole crew about regulation, and he said something I thought was, pretty on the point, which was, here I am, I'm proposing we do this and that. Am I coming up with ideas about something that I just really don't know enough about to regulate? And I think that can be the case. And so why it concerns me is more, I think more of the information and speech and content. I know there are a lot of other things you can regulate, but I'm trying to figure out, how do you do that? Who gets to say, you can't say that? Well, I guess Facebook, for instance, could say you can't say that. And maybe they should do a better job of that. But when the government comes in and says, you can't say this or you can't say that, that just starts to make me really nervous. So I have this weird, I guess that's why I sound so wishy-washy. I do feel like there are problems, but I'm not quite sure that there are ways to address that with regulation. I mean, I kind of think education is the way to go. A lot of this will probably sound naive, but if we could somehow, I mean, we're failing at educating on so many things. I don't know that we do much better here, but if we could somehow help build a generation and generations society of people who understand what's entirely BS, or how to find out whether it's BS, or how to process whether, well, actually that's really weird, but I think I'm kind of down with that. That would be fantastic. If there could be smart people who say, hey, you know what? People are starting to have trouble with Facebook. Why don't we start a thing that addresses problems 1, 2, and 3 that people have with Facebook, and could somehow make that a going business? Again, sounds a little naive. So I wouldn't say no regulation. So maybe it's a combination of these things, like education, regulation, competition. I mean, I was thinking about this with regulation and not coming up with laws, but through a combination of education and regulation, people wear seatbelts now. Most people, almost everybody. A lot of people have stopped smoking. There are, people recycle. It takes a long time, and it's not easy, and it's not bulletproof, so to speak. But I think there's a way without. Maybe regulation shouldn't be the first thing we reach for, I guess.
Thanks, Mike. Nicholas, would you like to say anything?
Yeah, I mean, I'm probably more, I was thinking about it. I'm probably more concerned about lack of access, and more kind of the deepening divide between the haves and the have-nots. And if you don't have access to today's technologies, sort of the challenge you have just functioning in the world and getting, I think about how, just like for myself, I've been regularly getting COVID tests to make sure I'm negative, which I've continued to be smart, wearing my mask, keeping my distance, and staying negative. But, I do it click, click, click online. And, it assumes a certain, to Mike's point, it assumes a certain level of education, quite frankly. You got to be able to kind of figure things out, to get registered, to get, signed up, and all these, questions that are asked. And then I have to have a phone to be able to get notification of my test results. So again, there's access that I have, that if it were not for that access, I don't know how I would function in the world. So I don't know if that's really regulation, but that is a particular, I guess, concern that I feel and that I have from a technology perspective.
Yeah, I think it also goes back to a sort of technological presumption that we will keep getting the next best, the next biggest, the next whatever. I don't have a smartphone anymore. I used to have a BlackBerry. That's about the smartest I got, and then BlackBerry wasn't supported by anybody. So I have a very dumb phone. But I'm very aware that the idea, I mean, I'm in Paris at the moment. If I was in the UK, it'd be the same. That I would need to have a smartphone in order to do so many things. I need to be able to have apps and the track and trace, for example, in the UK. So that is a concern of mine, is this idea of an alienation if you don't buy into the latest technology, and buy in quite literally into it.
Well, look where we are today with COVID and the pandemic and lockdowns. I mean, it actually, having technology and access to technology is dictating to some extent who can work and who can't work. You know, and maybe it's a little more than technology. It has to do with what job you hold, but the way this divide is accelerating, like a lot of things in the pandemic, is pretty fascinating and, you know, discouraging, I guess, and hopefully inspirational to some.
Yeah, I mean, we're finding a whole new world that can exist as we are now, you know, having a conversation across the Atlantic, across the Pacific, across America at least, in a way that we wouldn't have thought of. And, you know, there is something very positive about that. It's bringing people together,
Yes.
and not dividing us. So I think we're sort of getting to the point now where maybe, you know, Catherine, we can open it to the audience.
Yeah, sure. We do have some questions coming in already, so I think this would be a great moment to transition, and I'll go ahead and remind our audience that you can feel free to submit any questions you have for any of the panelists or for all of them in general, either to everyone sort of in the chat box, or you can submit them privately to me as well. So I'll go ahead and jump in here with the first one I received, which is a comment and a question. So this is following up on one of your earlier points that Mike in particular was making about journalism. So it reads, about 25% of the certified accounts on Twitter belong to journalists. As noted, they spend way too much time on Twitter quoting each other. How much damage is this doing to journalism today? And this is someone who wants to share his first computer was a 1969 timeshare mainframe, Silicon Valley area from 83 to 96. All right, so we've got some, feel free to share personal details. I think that's quite fun. We've got the time for it. So Mike, would you like to take that question maybe?
Well, I think it's an important question to which I'll provide one of my typically wishy-washy answers. But you know, I do think it has an upside and a downside. I mean, I do think there is a tremendous way to gather information through Twitter that, you know, you can get a story out quickly. It's almost a balance, right? Like the faster you do it, potentially the less accurate your story is. The longer you take, potentially the more accurate it is, but it may be less relevant. So I wouldn't ban reporters from using Twitter, but it's like anything else. When we switched, as we were talking about earlier, we switched from typewriters to computers of any sort to write stories. You know, you could use spell check, which particularly earlier on was notoriously inaccurate. You know, I'm one of the worst spellers around, and I could beat early spell check on certain words. So I guess what I'm trying to say is there are things that can be very helpful to journalism when they're used properly, or can, you know, allow journalists to slide into laziness. I think overall, you know, I think it's an overall plus for journalism. I also think, you know, I'll add one other thing. I do think it's another way to keep journalists on their toes. When I first started my career, it was just a one-way conversation. I mean, you could write a letter to the editor, which was important, but how many letters to the editor can get published? You can call the reporter, and if the reporter actually answers his or her phone, which I often did, but people often did not, you could leave a message, you know, I mean, but with Twitter, it obviously gets out of hand. It can be very ugly. It can be very disappointing, but it does allow people to say, hey, you know, you said this. Here, look at these following credible sources. It seems like one of you is wrong. Can you know, let's have a conversation about this.
Okay, great. Thank you, Mike. Nicholas or Christine, did either of you want to respond to that point, or should I move to the next question?
No, I think Yeah, I agree with what Mike says about the immediacy of being able to correct something or make a comment. But I think there's also a place for long form responses as well.
Hope so.
Yeah. Okay, thanks, Kathy.
Thank you. So the next question is going back to regulation. The question is, whose regulations apply? Governments apply regulations on a geographical basis, but the internet and online companies ignore geography. Who would write the regulations? That's a big question. So I'm not sure who wants to begin or take
I
that.
left my law degree in my other pants.
Yeah.
I don't know, but there are cases, right? There are controversies and cases going on about what certain companies can do in certain countries, and it's obviously complicated. So I don't have an answer to that. I do think countries can pass regulations and hold corporate entities within those countries to those standards, probably within that country, but it's a point that's very well taken. And maybe someone who's much smarter can rescue me from this one.
I think there's also, oh, sorry, Nicholas.
Go ahead, Christine. I think Nick is shaking his head, but.
Yeah, probably can't, but I know, like with my my day job at Ernst & Young, given that we're a global organization, I know that, we run into having, essentially we have to hold ourselves up to the highest standards that are out there. It's kind of, and so a lot of the regulation from a privacy perspective in Europe seems again, I feels like it's the kind of the highest standard, and so that ends up dictating how we manage data, manage privacy, really from a global perspective. Because to the person's point, data travels across borders and across continents, and so there's more risk than there is return of trying to. So we just maintain the highest level of security that's expected.
I think getting back to regulation, I think there's a sort of regulation that comes out of something we raised earlier to do with inequality in access to technology, but also in access to power. I was in Haiti after the earthquake in 2010, reporting from there. And of course, all the power lines were down, and those who could get online or get on a phone were those who could find somewhere to plug in and recharge. And so this is very much, what we're talking about to do with how people can connect. It's great, you can have all the tech to connect, but if you don't have the power to make that technology work, then you can't really connect.
Okay, great. Then we'll move to the next question here. Besides the Wayback Machine and the Computer History Museum, are there any other projects taking place to document the history of the internet and technology, especially outside of the US? Does anyone want to speak on that point?
Well, there are a lot of smaller computer history museums being set up all over the world. The Vintage Computer Festival in various parts of the world has conferences and festivals where people get together and have meetups. And of course, they've proliferated through technology, through learning about themselves, through communicating that way. So that's certainly really important. I don't know any other way to answer that. Nicholas or Mike, do you want to?
So I know that he is now a professor at the MBA school at the University of Maryland. His first name is David. What's his last name? It's escaping me. But he had gotten a grant to essentially archive .com 1.0. And so startup failures, all of everything, all of our content, the entire website became part of that archive. So I imagine there are probably other efforts like that going on all the time, kind of related to related to what you guys are sharing about.
And the Stanford Library has a pretty extensive collection of parts of Silicon Valley history and technology history, but it's not necessarily easily accessible, but it's there at least.
I know that computer history was a relatively new phenomenon. I see Dag Spice is in the room somewhere from the Computer History Museum. I know that when I was first in Silicon Valley in '99, when I wanted to apply this idea of archaeology to retro technology, the idea of collecting computers was sort of insane. I mean, people thought they were crazy. You know, who on earth would want to collect old mainframes? And of course, what happened, as you might know, is that these were the people who had all the manuals. They could make these things work and access the data when other people couldn't, when everything went down. And now, of course, it's actually part of archaeology. Computer history is now part of contemporary archaeology, so that memory sticks and things like that are regarded as artifacts. And that's happened relatively quickly. I mean, I know when I was lecturing probably a decade ago, and I would say to students, so, any of you have got old computers that you don't use anymore, but you don't want to throw away, and hands would start to come up and say, yeah, well, I've got something, I wrote X on it and I just don't want to throw it away. And it's like, it's in an attic, and it's part of their history, their personal history. And so it's not about, paperless society, it's about gathering this plastic junk, whatever you want to call it, or plastic artifacts that are meaningful. And that's quite a new development.
I have a hard time parting with electronics, but it's probably a whole nother conversation. I have trouble parting with a lot of things, but I'll keep them around for a while. And then I'll send a note to Dag, like, hey, you want an Apple iPod Touch? And he always politely writes back, well, actually, not a need for that in our collection currently. I can just imagine the sorts of notes he gets along those lines. I think I wanted to send him my AOL how-to manual or something. Or I don't know why I can't just throw it out and or recycle it, but I just feel like it belongs somewhere.
Yeah.
I have to learn, that, well, the iPod Touch that the Computer History Museum has, that represents everyone's iPod Touch. So you're free to send yours to the electronics recycler.
Yeah. And also what's so interesting is that you get people having conversations that used to be like, parents and children or grandparents and children. And now it's siblings talking about, oh, I had that one, back in the day 2 years ago,
Yeah. I'd be curious if people want to put in the chat what like your favorite device.
Yeah.
Like what's the device that, I mean, for me, like Christine, the BlackBerry with the raised letters, the keyboard.
Mm-hmm.
Like I'm terrible at the virtual keyboard, but the voice to text is pretty amazing right now, I have to say. But I really do miss the BlackBerry, just the simplicity of it. Email was really basic. The phone was decent. That was probably and it was smooth, had a smooth, round edges. It was kind of indestructible. You didn't need a screen protector and all that junk. It was all like in and of itself. Didn't need a bunch of other stuff to go with it. I miss my BlackBerry.
Yeah, I mean, look how blissed out we are. But it's also, for me, it was the time when the technology that I knew and the technology I wanted sort of came together at a point. I wasn't feeling as though I was oversold something that I didn't know, I had this thing and I had loads of stuff I didn't know what to do with. It was, it was a perfect bliss moment, yeah.
Despite being a late adopter, I did the first personal technology item I recall lusting after was a Palm Pilot Pro, which I eventually did. I saved up, I watched, like a smart consumer as the price of it declined because it was an electronic device. And I bought a Palm Pilot Pro, was so excited. I did use it quite a bit, but when you think about it, it did almost nothing. I mean,
Yeah.
it did a lot, but it
What?
couldn't connect to anything.
He took notes, like, I don't know,
Yeah.
electronic note or something. I had one. I don't know
Keep
it.
phone numbers and
Yeah.
had a stylus. Yeah, I don't know what's, and then preparing for this, I also ran into a column I wrote about my iPod Touch and how exciting that was. So like I said, I sometimes I resisted the smartphone because I thought I'm going to really like it, and then I can never get rid of it. I'll always have to have it, have to pay for the subscription, all this stuff. So my wife finally bought me for Christmas an iPod Touch and thought, kind of like the training wheels. And it was actually pretty incredible because if you had Wi-Fi, it was the same, people would argue, but it was kind of the same as an iPhone. It did pretty much all the stuff, much smaller screen and things like that. But so that's how they get you. And once I had that, it was like,
Yeah, there's sort of no end to the nostalgia we could give. And we do actually have some people sharing some, personal favorites, iPod minis, a grape iMac. So thank you for that suggestion, Nicholas. This has been great to see what's coming in here. I just have to share that this is so funny that you got to talking about having trouble parting with technology, because I spent the winter break here, I had a couple of weeks off, and I finally dealt with my tech graveyard. That's what I called it. It was like I had 3 old phones, and I'm somebody who uses her tech for years and years. I don't buy the latest things, but I still have accumulated, 3 computers, 4 cell phones, things like this. And so I finally have, had a little ceremony for each one. I'm able to let go of my classic iPod. And it's really strange the way that we really do develop very, very personal relationships with these technological objects. So I'm glad to know I'm not the only one.
Yeah, the first computer I ever bought was a Mac LC3, Apple LC3, which I bought in Oxford in '96 to write my doctoral thesis on. And the person selling it to me had written her thesis on it as well. And it was an incredibly moving moment when she handed over hers to me. And I sort of knew that embedded within it, in its memory, somehow was her thesis as well. Very poignant.
I hope you didn't submit the wrong one.
Yeah.
So we do have a couple more questions that we'll get to here that are coming in. So one is about, do you know of any organizations that advocate for tech fluency in the classroom, or policies to fight the digital divide that you support domestically in the US or internationally? I think that one might be a good one for Nicholas, if you have anything coming to mind. I
don't. I mean, I know EY has, we have efforts that I know that they, from a corporate perspective, I don't have any personal examples. I apologize, that I can think of. But I'd be interested if the community, if the community, certainly, I don't want to cut off Mike or Christine if you have any examples, but I'd welcome any suggestions from the community for sure.
Yeah, do that in chat too, huh?
Yeah.
But I was just going to say that I'm just coming up, drawing a blank, but if whoever asks a question would like to email me, I think there are a couple pretty well established outfits that I could send you. I just would have to look it up.
Yeah, I'd be happy to share your email address in the chat if you're happy with that, Mike, or would you like me to connect with the individual?
No, it's fine. Yeah.
Okay, I'll go ahead and drop that in before we say goodbye. Then thank you for that. I have another question here, which is, okay, so in the early days, changes in technology tended to be revolutionary, with new things never before seen. Now, with technology becoming more pervasive, are changes becoming more evolutionary? It could be for any of you. Maybe Christine. I mean, you've been writing on this topic for 20 plus years now, if you had any thoughts.
Yeah, I think really it goes back to the market driving the change, and the idea that each iteration has to have some extra gizmo, extra bells and whistles, which makes it the sort of thing that people will stand outside, for example, an Apple store, and buy the next one because it's the next big thing, as Michael Lewis described. So I think the evolution has come from that commercial standpoint, whereas I think back in the day, it was a different sort of idea that was much more communal in terms of technology, to move the technology forward together. I think it's extraordinary that there is still the PC Mac divide even now. Yeah.
I think so. One thought that I have there is we get, in terms of we get mini evolutions, if you will, like right now today, mobile apps are sort of pervasive with our experience of technology. And we get these, we get mini updates all the time, and they're not asking us for another $5 or $10 or whatever. They just continue to happen. And so I do think that there is kind of a constant evolution. And we used to actually have to pay for software. And so, there'd be a question of, do we want to pay for the next upgrade? What are we getting for that upgrade? So I do think there was more of a more commerce kind of with happening more routinely with whether or not we wanted to upgrade different software, and are we going to upgrade the hardware because we need it for the software. And so I do feel like that those transactions feel like they've kind of gone away. And so maybe they're happening, Apple wants me to pay an extra couple bucks for more storage. So maybe they're happening, but more often, but in smaller kind of, smaller decisions. I am curious, sort of, we've been really we have sort of focused on mobile apps for, it's been probably I guess good 8-10 years maybe. And I am kind of curious sort of what the next is going to be. There's always a next. So I am kind of wondering what, I hope it's not virtual, because I like the real world, but I don't know, could be something like that, where there's some sort of breakthrough and it becomes, maybe something with, Zoom becomes, that there's just, an incredible experience that we can have virtually that we can't have in this type, as great as this can be. Perhaps, there'll be something that will unlock that breakthrough, that it becomes then just what we all experience.
Yeah, remember that was like one of the, on the list of existential threats to Apple was, gee, they're just not coming up with anything new, particularly after the death of Steve Jobs. It's all just iterative. And I think, I do think something's coming. I don't know what, not necessarily from Apple, but maybe, but I don't know what it is. But I sometimes have this weird feeling like, well, they being technologists and inventors and entrepreneurs can't top that. So you sort of feel like, wow, we've pretty much done it. Like, we're here. And then, of course, something comes along that is completely different or unexpected, unless you're really, really, really paying attention.
Where's the next segue?
Yeah, yeah. Or someone mentioned the Newton in chat. I mean, that's got to be just around the corner.
Remember, Segway was going to replace all mobility. Remember that?
Yeah.
Boy, we were anxiously waiting for that.
For a while, they wouldn't say what it was either.
I know, right? It was such a it was a good PR firm. Definitely,
Yeah,
whoever the
really
PR
good.
firm was, they were better than probably the technology, but
Could be.
We actually have a question that follows up to that point a little bit. So this person is wondering about the marketing trends of tech companies moving forward. Did anybody have any thoughts on that, to have a view, to any predictions to the future about what we might see in 2021 and beyond from some of these tech firms? Go ahead, Mike, yeah?
Well, I'm in marketing at a tech firm, and I suppose I should have an answer, but sometimes I say I'm not a marketer, but I play one on TV. But I think seriously, this is going to sound, well, this is self-serving, but I think it's going to be a lot better. I think it's getting a lot better. I think marketing realizes that it's not about, well, I don't know that marketers have thought this for a long time, but it's not about fooling people. It's not about promising things you can't deliver, at least can't deliver very, very soon. It's more about trying to understand your market, trying to understand what the people you're trying to serve need, how that helps them, both in the organization as individuals, and how it helps the organization become, frankly, more profitable. But I think what that takes then is communication. It takes understanding those needs. It takes someone who can translate that need into a story about here's how you as a market can do what you're trying to do better. Here's what your peers or some of your peers have done to succeed. It probably sounds a little suspect coming from me, but I do think that there's going to be valuable, that there is now being valuable information produced by marketing teams, sure, for the purpose of doing better for the company they work for, but I think there's still some real value there.
I think getting back to old school marketing, looking at the Computer History Museum's archive of advertising for computers when they first came out is just an amazing masterclass in how things have evolved, to use that word again, over time, and who computers were marketed to and for what reasons. It's really interesting.
Yeah, I think marketing is becoming less about interrupting people and more about partnering with them, to use an overused term, but working with people to make so that both sides do better.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. Well, I don't see any other questions just yet coming in from the audience. I don't know if Christine, did you want to invite our panelists to make any concluding statements, or did you have any in mind? So please go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, actually, I'm thinking about, the response of technology to COVID, which is obviously all in our minds at the moment. And, Zoom is something I haven't actually used until the last few months. I don't know how both of you have responded to technology during this extraordinary period. And how we might actually evolve out of this using technology, benefits and otherwise.
I mean, I think my knee-jerk thoughts touch on a lot of things we have talked about, but I have many times over the last 10 months or so wondered, what would this experience be like 10 years ago, maybe even 5 years ago? What would I be doing? And I do feel so fortunate that I'm kind of doing what I was doing before, slightly different, some different methods, and I'm working from home instead of an office and things like that. But technology is so integral in allowing me to do that. And plus, visiting with family, friends. It was very awkward at first. I don't know, it wasn't very awkward with family. Sometimes with friends that I hadn't really visited that way before. Felt a little awkward. It's much less awkward now. I know it's been said by a lot of people, but I actually see some people more often now than I did. I think it's, I think many of us are so fortunate to have these tools available, both for working, but also for living.
I desperately miss live music. I will be honest. I appreciate all the artists, me included, doing live streams and all that, but it is just not the same at all. So I look forward to that coming back. On the flip side, with speaking specifically, like with Graham's Foundation as an example, we've always delivered our services virtually, whether it's our care packages, our mobile app, our mentors. So we really haven't missed a beat from that perspective. And actually, we typically have our gala in New York, and we had it virtually, and the attendance was fantastic. We had people from around the country, some people from even outside the US attend. And we were able to have participation at a level that we just never would have had before. And so we're going to continue. We will continue to have, our major gala, we'll continue to do it virtually, because while as much as we miss the ability to hug each other and to network some of the in-person, actually delivering on the intent of the event, we were able to do it actually more effectively virtually than the effort that it takes to be in person. So I think it's really truly treasuring the opportunity for the in-person connection, and then also recognizing that this type of experience it also can be really useful and powerful as well. And that's how Christine and I were able to reconnect as well. So I'm grateful for that.
Yeah, I've been very inspired by old tech and new tech coming together, and the sort of the resourcefulness and the way that people have been thinking around a situation when presented with a challenge. For recording, for example, I did a BBC recording a few months ago and had to do it underneath a duvet in a small room in Paris, and it just felt like the most old school you could do, and it worked in a way, but it just felt like incredibly unraveling 20 odd years of tech to go under the duvet to do this.
Well, great. Well, this has been such an interesting conversation to have with the three of you. So thank you for joining us from France and across the US. And of course, also to our audience who has had a wonderful engagement and questions throughout this program. I really appreciate you spending the evening with us. I think I just might conclude by drawing anyone's attention who's here tonight to our big book award ceremony next week. So we have another public event. It's also free. It's mostly an opportunity to honor this year's book award winner. So the American Library in Paris awards a prize to what they have selected as the best book about France or the French written in English every year. And this year's ceremony will be on the 14th of January. So that's next Thursday, also at this time slot, just at 7:30. So if you'd like to register for that, you can find more information right now on our homepage, and go ahead and join us from anywhere in the world. Again, kind of the wonderful thing about this moment is that we can all come together, no matter if you're in Paris or not. And this will be an opportunity also to thank our donors. It's our annual Donor Appreciation Award. In any event, if you're not able to make that one, I invite you to check out our other programs, which are up for the months of January and February, and you can find them on our homepage, on our programs calendar, and sign up in the same fashion that you did for tonight's program. Also, before I let everyone go, I'd like to remind you that the American Library in Paris is an independent nonprofit, and we do welcome donations. So if you're interested in donating, if you enjoyed tonight's program, traditionally in person, we welcome donations of about 10 euros per person per event. So if you'd like to support us, please, you'll just find that email where I sent out this Zoom link, and just above that, there's a link to donate to the library.
Do you take US dollars? Do they transfer? They change them into US dollars into euros?
You can also actually donate directly in dollars. So thank you for that question. Absolutely, right. I should make a point to say that in euros or dollars, either way is totally acceptable, and we have tax reduction forms we can give you as well. So thank you everyone to being here. Thank you once again to Christine, who has moderated so gracefully tonight, and to Nicholas and Mike for joining us and sharing your experience.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. It's great.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you. Until next time.
Bye.